Imagine waking up one morning, living your life as usual, and by nightfall, finding yourself in handcuffs for a crime you never committed. Imagine standing in a courtroom hearing a judge sentence you to life, or worse, death, based on lies, unreliable witnesses, or corrupt officials. Imagine spending decades behind bars, screaming your innocence, only for no one to listen. This isn't a nightmare. This is the reality for countless innocent men and women in America, wrongfully convicted, their lives shattered by a justice system meant to protect them. Some were sent away because of mistaken identity, others because of coerced confessions, tampered evidence, or racial bias. And some would never make it out alive. This video reveals the devastating truth about wrongful convictions in the U.S. Each case exposes a different flaw in the system, flaws that destroy lives. This isn't just about the past. These injustices still happen today. And for every innocent person freed, countless others remain trapped in a legal nightmare. The question is, how many more lives must be stolen before real change happens? The wrongful conviction of Steven Avery, 1985. What happens when the system turns its back on you and you're left to face years of punishment for something you didn't do? Steven Avery, a man from Manitowoc, Wisconsin, knows all too well the pain of being wrongfully convicted. In 1985, Avery was convicted of the rape of Penny Bernstein based on flawed eyewitness identification, a case that would leave him behind bars for 18 years for a crime he never committed. The case began when Penny Bernstein, a woman out for a jog, was violently attacked and raped. She was able to identify her attacker, but under police pressure and the influence of a suggestive lineup, her memory was clouded. She mistakenly identified Avery, a man with a criminal record but no history of sexual assault. At the time, the police were eager to close the case quickly, and Avery was the perfect suspect. Despite his strong alibi, Avery was arrested and charged. The prosecution relied heavily on the victim's identification, and the defense did little to challenge it. It didn't matter that Avery was at home at the time of the attack. It didn't matter that the evidence didn't match him. He was found guilty. For 18 years, Avery fought from within prison walls to clear his name. He filed countless motions, seeking new DNA testing, but it was always rejected. His family supported him, but the legal system seemed bent on maintaining the conviction. Then, in 2003, DNA testing finally provided the breakthrough. A match was found that proved Avery's innocence. The real perpetrator, a man named Gregory Allen, was identified. Avery was exonerated and released from prison. But Avery's fight didn't end there. In 2005, he was again arrested, this time for the murder of Teresa Halbach. The case against him was controversial, filled with suspicious circumstances, and many believe the law enforcement community wanted revenge for his earlier exoneration. His case became one of the most high-profile wrongful convictions in modern history. The twists and turns in his story continue to spark debates on the failures of the justice system. The wrongful conviction of Ray Crone, 2002. How does it feel to be sent to death row for a crime you didn't commit? How do you prove your innocence when the entire system seems determined to convict you? Ray Crone was sentenced to death for the brutal murder of Kim Ancona, despite the fact that the evidence against him was flawed and misleading. The wrongful conviction would cost him more than a decade of his life. In 1992, Crone was arrested and convicted of the murder of Kim Ancona, a Phoenix waitress who was found dead in her apartment. The case seemed open and shut. The blood found at the crime scene matched Crone's blood type, and a composite sketch based on a witness description looked like him. To the jury, this was enough to convict him, but Crone's story was different. He had no prior connection to the victim, and the forensic evidence was far from conclusive. The blood match was based on type, not DNA, and Crone's defense team failed to challenge it effectively. Additionally, a key eyewitness later recanted his statement. For years, Crone maintained his innocence, but the justice system wasn't listening. He was sentenced to death and spent over a decade on death row. The years were filled with heartache and frustration, as Crone's efforts to clear his name were ignored. Then, in 2002, a breakthrough came. Advances in DNA testing proved that Crone was not the murderer. The evidence that had originally linked him to the crime was re-examined and found to be faulty. The real killer was identified, and Crone was exonerated after serving more than a decade on death row. Ray Crone's case is a stark reminder of how quickly the system can convict a person on shaky evidence, and how difficult it can be to prove your innocence once you're caught in its grip. His story highlights the importance of proper forensic analysis and the necessity of challenging wrongful convictions, even when the world seems determined to keep you locked away. The wrongful conviction of the Central Park 5, 1989. What happens when innocent teenagers are caught in the whirlwind of a crime they didn't commit? What happens when the system is more interested in solving a case than finding the truth? The Central Park 5 teenagers from New York City, spent years in prison for a crime they didn't commit, falsely convicted of the brutal attack on a woman known as the Central Park Jogger. Their confessions were coerced, and their stories ignored. In April 1989, a woman named Tricia May Lee was brutally attacked and raped while jogging in Central Park. The police quickly turned their attention to 5 young men: Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCrae, Yusef Salam, and Corey Wise. The boys were questioned separately, without their parents or lawyers present, and under intense pressure, they each gave confessions that were inconsistent with each other. Despite the fact that the confessions were filled with inconsistencies, the boys were charged and convicted of the crime. The media painted them as a dangerous group of young men who were part of a gang, and their names became synonymous with crime. The case was a national sensation, and the public clamored for justice. For years, the boys maintained their innocence, but no one believed them. They spent between 6 and 13 years in prison, while the real perpetrator, Matias Reyes, remained free. It wasn't until 2002, when Reyes confessed to the crime and DNA testing confirmed his guilt, that the boys were exonerated. The Central Park 5's case remains one of the most infamous examples of wrongful conviction, shining a light on the systemic failures of the justice system and the dangers of coerced confessions. Their exoneration came too late to undo the damage done to their lives, but their story serves as a powerful reminder of how the justice system can fail even the most vulnerable. The wrongful conviction of the Hutto family, 1989. What happens when a young man, already shattered by the loss of his family, is forced to endure a second betrayal? This time by the very system meant to protect him? What happens when the death of loved ones is twisted into an accusation of murder, and the line between justice and vengeance is blurred? The fire that claimed the Hutto family's lives was horrifying. Firefighters fought the flames for hours, but there was no saving the family. Once the blaze was extinguished, investigators began combing through the debris for answers. The fire was suspicious. No one could figure out how it started. In the early hours of the investigation, there were several anomalies that seemed to point toward arson. Fire accelerants, such as gasoline, were found in various parts of the home. This led the authorities to quickly conclude that someone had intentionally started the fire. Matthew Hutto, the lone survivor of the fire, became the prime suspect. Although he had been severely burned in the fire himself, and had managed to escape with his life, the authorities focused on him almost immediately. Why? Because he stood to gain financially from the deaths of his family. The theory was simple. Matthew was allegedly motivated by greed and intended to use the insurance payout to start over. In their eyes, a teenager who had recently turned 17 could have been desperate enough to set such a horrific fire. His behavior following the fire was scrutinized, and his actions interpreted through the lens of suspicion. Matthew had been taken to the hospital and was visibly in shock, but the authorities portrayed his emotional state as callousness. His failure to grieve in the way they thought he should was seen as proof of his guilt. Moreover, a key piece of circumstantial evidence was his previous statements during questioning, which were later twisted into confessions. He had mentioned things about the fire and his family in ways that seemed to point toward guilt, though they were, in reality, just the confused ramblings of a teenager traumatized by what had happened. His words were taken out of context, and his psychological state was ignored. As the investigation continued, a poor defense strategy became clear. Matthew's defense attorneys were not equipped to counter the prosecution's case. With no physical evidence linking him directly to the crime, the authorities continued to rely on an emotional narrative, a greedy young man killing his family for insurance money. The trial was a blur. The jury deliberated, but despite the lack of direct evidence, they convicted him. It wasn't about whether or not Matthew had set the fire. It was about a theory that fit their preconceived notions. Matthew was sentenced to life in prison, a punishment that seemed inevitable despite his claims of innocence. The trauma of losing his family was compounded by the loss of his freedom, a deep injustice that would take years to rectify. Over the years, Matthew maintained his innocence, but the case seemed closed. The state of Texas, however, seemed uninterested in reopening it. The pressure mounted for justice to be done, but every attempt to get the case reviewed fell on deaf ears. The investigation into the fire was flawed. The evidence used to convict Matthew was circumstantial at best. No one had properly investigated the possibility of an electrical malfunction or another potential cause for the fire. It wasn't until much later, in 2005, that key new evidence was brought forward. A fire expert, reviewing the case years after the conviction, found that the fire likely hadn't been started intentionally. In fact, he concluded that the fire was likely caused by an electrical malfunction, a theory that the original investigators had overlooked entirely. With this new revelation, Matthew's defense team filed a motion to have the conviction overturned. After years of being imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, Matthew was granted a new trial. This time, with the help of new evidence, his conviction was overturned. The truth was finally revealed. Matthew had never set the fire. He had never even been responsible for the deaths of his family. He had only been a victim of a tragedy that turned into a wrongful conviction, a victim of the legal system's failure to see beyond its initial theory. Matthew's release was bittersweet. Although he was exonerated, his family could never be replaced. The time he spent in prison was lost, and the memories of his family were now tainted by the system's failure to provide him with justice. Still, his story is a reminder of how easily a tragedy can be twisted into something more, and how often the true victims in such cases are the innocent who get caught in the legal machinery. The wrongful conviction of Anthony Graves, 1992. What does it feel like to know the state has marked you for death? To be told the exact day, the exact hour, the exact moment when they will strap you to a gurney and inject poison into your veins? This was the nightmarish reality Anthony Graves lived through for 18 years. In 1992, the small town of Somerville, Texas, was rocked by a brutal crime. 6 members of the Davis family, including 4 children, were savagely murdered in their home. The crime scene was horrific. Bodies burned beyond recognition, a house filled with the stench of gasoline and smoke. Law enforcement quickly arrested Robert Earl Carter, a man with a violent past. Under pressure to name an accomplice, Carter pointed the finger at Anthony Graves. He claimed they had committed the murders together. There was no forensic evidence, no DNA, no credible witnesses, just Carter's testimony, which he later admitted was a lie. Despite this, Graves was convicted and sentenced to death in 1994. He spent years in solitary confinement, locked in a 6-by-9-foot cell, waiting to die. His legal team fought tirelessly, uncovering shocking prosecutorial misconduct. The district attorney had fabricated evidence, withheld crucial details, and even coerced false testimonies. Then, in a twist of fate, Robert Earl Carter, just hours before his own execution, confessed that Anthony Graves was innocent. He begged the courts to intervene, but the system refused to listen. It took until 2010, 18 years after his conviction, for a federal court to finally overturn his case. Anthony Graves was exonerated. The prosecutor who built the case against him was later disbarred for misconduct. Graves was awarded compensation, but no amount of money could ever return what was stolen from him. His story remains a chilling example of how dangerously flawed the death penalty system is. How many more innocent people are sitting on death row right now, waiting for a justice that may never come? The wrongful conviction of Richard Lee Richards, 1984. What happens when an innocent man is convicted for a crime he didn't commit? How many years of life do you lose when the system fails to recognize the truth? Richard Lee Richards, a man from Oklahoma, knows exactly what that feels like. In 1984, Richards was sentenced to life in prison for a murder he didn't commit. A crime that, despite all the evidence to the contrary, saw him behind bars for nearly 2 decades. The case began in December 1984. A man named John D. Williams was found dead in a hotel room in Oklahoma City. The police quickly pinned the crime on Richards, a man with a history of minor offenses, but no violent crimes. The evidence was circumstantial at best. Richards was seen in the area, but there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. The supposed motive was weak, a robbery gone wrong. Despite this, Richards was arrested and charged. The case hinged on eyewitness testimony from a witness who later recanted his statement, claiming the police had pressured him to lie. But no one seemed to care. Richards went to trial, and the prosecution painted a picture of him as a violent man capable of such a brutal act. His defense was poorly prepared, and the jury returned a guilty verdict without much hesitation. For the next 16 years, Richards sat in prison, fighting for his innocence. His family never gave up on him, but the system did. Every appeal was denied. There was no physical evidence to prove his innocence, just his word against the system. In 2001, a break came when the Oklahoma Innocence Project took on his case. They re-examined the evidence, and what they found changed everything. DNA testing on evidence that had been stored for years proved Richards' innocence. The real killer was a man named Ronnie Earl Watkins, a man who had already served time for similar crimes and whose DNA was a perfect match to the evidence found at the crime scene. Richard Lee Richards was exonerated in 2001 after spending 17 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit. His case remains a testament to the flaws of the justice system. The time he lost, the relationships that were destroyed, and the person he could have been all lay in the wake of an innocent man's wrongful conviction. This case serves as a chilling reminder that the system is not always just, and that a person's life can be ripped away in an instant, even if they're innocent. The wrongful conviction of Glenn Ford, 1984. Imagine being sentenced to death for a crime you didn't commit. Imagine spending nearly 3 decades on death row, knowing in your heart that you're innocent, yet being ignored by everyone. Glenn Ford, a man from Louisiana, spent 30 years on death row for a murder he didn't commit. 30 years of his life stolen by the justice system that had already decided his fate, and no one listened. The case began in 1983, when Isidore Roseman, a well-known Jewish civil rights lawyer, was found murdered in his home. The evidence against Ford was almost non-existent. He had been at the scene, but there were no witnesses, no physical evidence, and no motive. Ford was an acquaintance of the victim, but that didn't make him guilty. Ford's conviction was based on a hasty confession, a confession that he later recanted, claiming that he had been coerced by the police. But the damage was done. Ford was convicted and sentenced to death, and the case quickly faded from the public's mind. For years, Ford's name was synonymous with crime, and the public seemed to forget the questions surrounding his conviction. But for Ford, the years dragged on. He sat in a tiny cell on death row, stripped of his dignity, his hopes, and his dreams. He had no chance for parole, and his appeals were always denied. As the years passed, new evidence emerged, evidence that pointed to Ford's innocence. But the state was too proud to admit that they had been wrong. They refused to look at the facts. In 2014, after 30 years of legal battles, Ford was finally exonerated. A new investigation uncovered the truth. The real murderer had been another man, whose identity was known all along, but had been ignored. Ford was released from death row, but the damage had already been done. The years lost, the relationships ruined, and the years of trauma left scars that would never fully heal. Glenn Ford's case is one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice in U.S. history. It shows how easy it is for the system to write off a person's life, especially if they're poor or from a marginalized community. And even when the truth comes out, it's often too late. Ford was denied his rightful freedom for decades, and the injustice he suffered will never be forgotten. The wrongful conviction of Kenneth Reed, 1981. What does it take for an innocent man to prove his innocence? What happens when the very system designed to protect you betrays you instead? Kenneth Reed, a young man from New York, spent over 14 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. His story is a stark reminder of how easily an innocent person can be wrongfully convicted, even when the evidence is slim and the case is built on the faulty testimony of unreliable witnesses. The crime occurred in 1981 when a man named William Ford was shot and killed in a robbery. Reed was arrested after several eyewitnesses mistakenly identified him as the shooter. Despite the fact that none of the physical evidence linked him to the crime and that he had a solid alibi, Reed was convicted based on witness misidentification. Reed's conviction rested entirely on witness testimony. The witnesses had been shown police lineups, and many of them were pressured into identifying Reed as the shooter. But the problem was that they had been mistaken. The real killer had a completely different description. Even after his conviction, Reed maintained his innocence. He filed multiple appeals and sought legal assistance, but no one listened. The legal system continued to ignore his case, dismissing his claims as a defense strategy. Meanwhile, Reed languished in prison, enduring the harsh conditions of a maximum security facility. In 1994, after years of legal battles, DNA testing revealed the truth. The evidence at the crime scene did not match Reed's DNA. The real killer was a man named Robert Brown, whose DNA matched the evidence. After over a decade of wrongful imprisonment, Reed was exonerated and released from prison in 1995. Kenneth Reed's case highlights the deep flaws in the justice system. The wrongful conviction cost him more than a decade of his life, and although he was released, the trauma he endured can never be undone. His case remains a chilling example of how the system can fail even the most innocent among us. The wrongful conviction of James Bain, 1974. How many years of your life could you survive behind bars for a crime you didn't commit? 5? 10? Now imagine 35 years. That's 12,775 days of your life wasted, spent in a cage while the real criminal walks free. James Bain didn't just lose time, he lost his youth, his relationships, his dreams, and his chance at a normal life. And for what? A wrongful conviction built on a faulty eyewitness identification, racial bias, and a broken justice system that refused to listen to the truth. The nightmare began on March 4, 1974, in Lake Wales, Florida. A 9-year-old boy had been abducted from his home, taken to a remote field, and brutally raped. The child later described his attacker as a black man with bushy sideburns and a mustache. It wasn't much to go on, but the police were desperate to make an arrest. Bain, a local 19-year-old with no criminal record, was singled out as a suspect, despite there being no physical evidence against him. The child was asked to pick his attacker from a lineup, but Bain wasn't even in the original group. Instead, officers manipulated the situation by telling the boy that James Bain was the man responsible, effectively planting the idea in his mind. Under pressure, the boy identified Bain as his attacker. That was all the prosecution needed. No DNA evidence, no fingerprints, no reliable testimony, just the shaky word of a traumatized child who had been misled by police. Bain's fate was sealed. The trial was swift. Despite his alibi, he had been home with his family at the time of the crime. The jury convicted him. Sentenced to life, Bain was sent to Florida State Prison, a place known for its harsh conditions and brutal violence. For years, Bain lived in the hell of wrongful imprisonment. He faced daily threats, isolation, and the crushing knowledge that no one believed him. He wrote appeal after appeal, each one denied without reconsideration. The legal system had branded him guilty, and that label seemed permanent. As the years passed, science advanced. By the 1990s, DNA testing had become a powerful tool for exonerating the innocent. Bain knew that if the biological evidence from the crime scene could be tested, it would prove he was not the attacker. But every request he made for DNA testing was denied. It wasn't until 2009, 35 years later, that the Florida Innocence Project took on his case. They pushed for DNA testing on the evidence that had been stored for decades. When the results came back, they confirmed what Bain had always known. The DNA did not match him. James Bain was finally declared innocent and released on December 17, 2009. He had spent more than 3 decades in prison for a crime he never committed. His release was bittersweet. He was now a free man, but he had lost his youth. He had never owned a cell phone, never used the internet, never seen the world evolve outside of prison walls. He was given $1.7 million in compensation, but what is money compared to 35 years of stolen life? The The James Bain case is one of the longest known wrongful imprisonments in U.S. history. It serves as a devastating reminder of how easily an innocent person can be thrown away by the justice system. And the scariest part? If DNA testing hadn't been allowed, Bain would have died in prison, an innocent man forever labeled as a monster. The wrongful conviction of Anthony Porter, 1982. Imagine being strapped to a gurney waiting to die. Imagine the cold sting of the IV as the executioner prepares the lethal injection. Now imagine, in the final hours before your death, new evidence emerges, proving that you never committed the crime in the first place. This isn't a hypothetical. This was the horrifying reality for Anthony Porter, a man who came within 48 hours of execution for a crime he didn't commit. The case began in 1982 in Chicago. Marilyn Green and Jerry Hillard, a young couple, were found shot to death in a park. Witnesses claimed that Anthony Porter, a local man with a criminal record, was responsible. The case against Porter was built almost entirely on the testimony of one eyewitness, William Taylor. Taylor claimed he had seen Porter shoot the victims, but his testimony was inconsistent. There was no forensic evidence, no murder weapon, and no clear motive. Still, Porter was convicted and sentenced to death. For 16 years, he sat on death row, filing appeals that went nowhere. He had accepted his fate. He had been condemned to die, and the system wasn't interested in reconsidering his case. Then, in 1998, Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism took an interest in Porter's story. Under the guidance of Professor David Protes, a group of journalism students began reinvestigating the case. What they uncovered was shocking. They tracked down William Taylor, the prosecution's star witness. Under pressure, he admitted that police had coerced him into identifying Porter. He had been threatened and manipulated into lying under oath. The students dug deeper and eventually found the real killer, all-story Simon. Confronted with new evidence, Simon confessed to the murders. It was an explosive revelation. With only 48 hours left before his execution, Porter's case was thrown into chaos. The governor of Illinois intervened, staying the execution just in time. Porter was exonerated in 1999, becoming one of the most high-profile wrongful convictions in U.S. history. His case was a turning point. It was one of the driving forces behind Illinois' decision to abolish the death penalty in 2011. It proved how dangerously close the system came to executing an innocent man. If not for a group of journalism students, Anthony Porter would have been just another statistic, a wrongful execution, buried and forgotten. Now let's really think about these false convictions. Sit with a heavy heart, knowing that each of these stories is not just about the crimes they were accused of, but about the countless lives shattered by a broken system. Each of these cases, though different in their details, all carry the same bitter truth. The justice system can and does fail, and when it does, the consequences are irreversible. These individuals weren't just denied their freedom, they were stripped of their humanity, their dignity, and their futures. Each case is a painful reminder of the fragility of justice and the haunting consequences of wrongful convictions. One by one, they tell the story of a broken system, its victims, and the long road to redemption that far too many never get to walk. As we reflect on these 10 stories, we cannot help but recognize the ripple effects that extend beyond just the wrongfully convicted. The families, friends, and communities of these individuals were also affected, left grappling with confusion, heartache, and sometimes the burden of silence. Take Ray Crone, for example. The years spent behind bars not only changed his life, but the lives of those who loved him, forever altering their understanding of what justice truly is. His wrongful conviction fractured his relationships and tainted the lives of his supporters, who could only watch as the system slowly worked against him. The pain these men endured is beyond what words can express, and yet their stories remind us of the importance of never accepting easy answers or settling for convictions that lack truth. And then, it's not just the wrongful convictions we must confront. It's the people behind the numbers. It's the sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, and entire communities left behind in the wake of injustice. James Bain, Anthony Porter, Stephen Avery, and the Hutton brothers are more than just names to be remembered. They are a testament to the need for vigilance, for the protection of human dignity, and for an unrelenting pursuit of truth. And as we look at their cases, we must ask ourselves, how many more innocent lives are caught in the web of a system that doesn't always care about the truth? How many more individuals will face years or even decades of their lives being consumed by a criminal justice system that simply doesn't get it right? Their stories, painful and raw, serve as a stark reminder that we must do better. We must demand a justice system that seeks truth and integrity above all else. One that doesn't simply punish for the sake of punishment, but aims for a fair, transparent process that never loses sight of the very individuals whose lives are on the line. Their wrongful convictions aren't just injustices. They are opportunities for us to learn, grow, and ensure that this doesn't continue happening. While it may seem like the damage is irreversible, there is power in sharing these stories. There is strength in raising awareness and acknowledging the failures of the system so that future generations won't have to suffer the same fate. The fight for justice is never over, and the stories of Ray Crone, the Central Park Five, Anthony Graves, Glenn Ford, Richard Lee Richards, Kenneth Reed, James Bain, Anthony Porter, Stephen Avery, and the Hutton brothers will continue to resonate, urging us all to take action, to demand change, and to never forget the lessons their lives teach us. Stay tuned for more videos on innocent convicted people on our playlist. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And as always, stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next one.